Hey, welcome. This is Charlotte Pierce of Pierce Press. I produce the Peeragogy in Action podcast, or I collaborate on it. This is Peeragogy in Action. It's actually our 6th episode. And in the Peeragogy Project, we collaborate to build the no longer missing guide to all things relevant to successful peer production and peer learning. And the Peeragogy in Action live stream and video and audio podcast aims to provide an interactive space where participants and audience can explore the philosophies and concepts, contributors, people in the world of peer learning and peer production. We aim to keep the discussions informal and free-flowing with some kind of minimal guidelines. So we usually have 2 or 3 talking points. And we live stream via video to the Peeragogy channels on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn. So please consider subscribing. You can also, just real easy thing to remember is peeragogy.org is our website, and you can find all the links to the various places, platforms that we use. So please consider subscribing and participating in our future episodes. And I'm going to turn it over now to Joe Corneli, who is our host today, and I'm going to pop out and run the back end of things backstage. Thanks, Joe. Hi.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah. Hi, I'm Joe, and I'm so excited to be on episode 6. That feels like a milestone, even more than 5. But the important thing today is to introduce Noorah and Amanda, who are our guests today. Let's say Noorah is, in Peeragogy terms, a newcomer to the Peeragogy Project and Peeragogy things. I've gotten to know her in an Emacs research group where we're using some of the ideas of Peeragogy. And Amanda is, I don't know, what's the opposite of a newcomer, an old-timer of the Peeragogy Project, who's been with us from perhaps the very start. If you look at some of these little icon up in the upper right, this looks like it's maybe got an Amanda signature on it. And really, Amanda has provided a lot of the visual DNA of the Peeragogy Project. If you ever put it on Google image search, you will find Amanda Lyons images there. So, and for example, Charlotte has one in her background if you're watching. On the other hand, some people are listening only, so you'll be really missing out. If you're only listening, do go visit visualsforchange.com in your own time, and you can see more of Amanda's artwork there. Yeah, what we're going to talk about today is visualizing life patterns. Oh, and by the way, there's an extra special guest with Amanda. Catalina is a real newcomer to the whole. This is her first podcast, so this is pretty impressive. But yeah, so obviously life has been developing for you, Amanda, in exciting ways. That's one of the interesting life patterns. Briefly to introduce Noorah, really, I should let you introduce yourselves, but Noorah, what I know about you is you're a PhD student in policy affairs in Texas. Do you want to say a bit more about what you're studying in your PhD?
Yeah, hi, I'm a PhD student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So right now I study climate policies. So a lot to do with patterns, a lot to do with moving parts, and a lot of uncertainty and how we learn along the way. So yeah, and then I met Joe at an Emacs conference. So while using open source software to work together and just ease the research process.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic. Amanda, as I said a lot about your art, I would just also like to say we're going to have art from you throughout the thing. And I think one of the ideas was that you might do some drawings here live. I don't know if you can kind of multitask here with your 2 arms there and also show us any drawings. But do you want to introduce us a little bit to what we see around you as well? I see some paintings and drawings and baby all here. So how is it going there in the conditions of lockdown as an artist? You're based in New York still, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in Brooklyn, New York. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
So excited to be here. And I find art to be really healing and really necessary, particularly in this time, both as new mom and as just a human. I am playing a little bit via paper. We will see how much I can actually do this and that, and I might get some help with the little one at some point. But I am really all about helping people use visuals and use art in order to, whatever it is, right? Solve problems, feel life more, understand life more, communicate. It's kind of a fill in the blank. So
that's super. I'm really excited by this kind of mashup thing. I think I noticed some commonality. Speaking of patterns, I noticed that all of us actually have some art in the background. So I think all of us can, even though maybe not all of us will identify as visual artists, we can all identify with like having meaningful art in our lives. So that's very cool. So yeah, Charlotte, I'm popping in to say hi. So Charlotte, if you show us this topic one, the question we would like to open with, I think, is what do patterns, life patterns, look like or feel like? And here's some illustrations. There's a bubble, but yeah, what do the patterns in our life look like and feel like? And this little image here, for those on the video feed, is from Christopher Alexander with kind of these 15 properties of wholeness. So I don't declare that all life patterns must feel like that. Maybe roughness is an example. Life can feel rough sometimes. Or when Noorah and I were chatting about this before, we were talking about boundaries, like the transition to becoming a mother is kind of like, before you weren't a mother, now you are. So maybe it's not a boundary, but it's a change, a huge change, as I know as an uncle from witnessing my sister's experience. So maybe you both would love to just elaborate a bit about what life patterns feel like for you in your life, moving country, studying. How do we think about, or how do we experience the feelings of our patterns, and how do we think about or experience the visual aspects? How do we visualize these things? So to give some order to this, let's go to Noorah first, if it's okay, and give Amanda a chance to sketch on paper if she wants or is able, as Noorah answers this quite open question.
Well, when I'm thinking about life patterns, I'm always thinking about my research and public policy. And so what I relate to is mostly the boundaries. It's you're always operating within boundaries. And so to understand, for example, like how things work and why things work, the most that I've learned from is like drawing diagrams, and just to understand how, like, from one point to the other, what happens in between. So that's how I think about it. But like when I looked at the picture that you showed of like Alexander's properties of wholeness, it made me think of something else as well. So for example, like, sorry, I need to pull it up again. One of them with the boundaries is like, it looks like a map. So what is the inside and what is the outside? So that's something that is worth thinking about when we're drawing, like, you know, territories or things like that. So that's how I think about life patterns.
That's interesting. When I was hearing about boundaries, I didn't even think of the idea of an inside and outside, even though that picture is a circle. But I was thinking about like Hadrian's Wall or something, a boundary that divides people across things without there necessarily being an inside, but just two sides. So how about you, Amanda? How do you? I mean, I know thinking visually is such a key thing for you, but how do you think about life patterns and the patterns of your life or life in general?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I love sort of what you just said, and to piggyback off of inside and outside, Noorah, some of how I think about patterns are sort of seeing patterns, thinking patterns, feeling patterns, the handoff. And, you know, I really think that there's something to creative patterns too, and not only how we feel and think, but we all have it, right? We all have this creative way of being in the world, right? Even if you consider yourself an artist or don't, right? There's I live in New York City. So how do I get my car out of the snow in the street, right? Like that's a creative problem to figure out. How do I, you know, have a conversation with this person who thinks really differently than me? That's a creative challenge, right? So there's all different kinds of creativity if we sort of blow it up really big for a minute. And then there's however we sort of as humans show up in that moment. And so for me, when I think patterns of thinking, and part of, I think, how I got pulled into this was thinking about my own patterns, right? And what they mean. And when I choose them, consciously and when I choose them unconsciously. And so when you spoke about inside and outside, Noorah, where I went was to me and to my human body. And how do I show up in the world in a way where I'm aware of some of those patterns, right? Both the conscious and the unconscious ones. I'm pulling them out a little bit, right? And so I appreciate this visual that you pulled up, the properties of wholeness, right? I want to sit here and play with it and like take it in a little bit more even. Yeah, there's so much amazingness here, right? This sort of echo, I'm looking at the echoes at the moment, similarity. And to me, I think nature, right, is another place that I go when I think about these patterns, right? I go to biology, I go to nature. I take a walk every day in the park with my little, and it's by far one of the best parts of my day. And that pattern for me of allowing my body to spend time in nature really shifts me and shifts, talk about mood shifts, that it completely shifts me. And allows me to play with the boundaries too, right? And the boundaries of not only sort of where I am in the moment, but how I'm thinking, right? And becoming aware of those boundaries of our thinking that we aren't aware of so often, right? And so what happens when we start to pull those out and become aware of them?
I think I find that so exciting because I think I go from patterns, for example, of patterns you might do every day to other things that are other patterns, like the way we breathe. But then in the world of policy, it's like, where did the park come from? I think one of the examples Noorah and I were talking about is if you want to design a city, don't build on every last available piece of square inch of ground, because you can create, some healthy living for people there. And it's like all these different levels from like minute to minute versus day to day versus maybe every, few hundred years, people will think about how to build a brand new city or something like that, or how to change the landscape. But I don't know, we're always kind of working all these different skills. I like what you said about working across them. Charlotte, if you could flip ahead, I know we love these 15 patterns, and maybe we'll be able to come back into them again, but there's some other cool images ahead about shapes that might be fun to inspire some more thinking. There's the bubbles. There's this image of bubbles actually kind of getting little holes inside them as they're about to pop. And so it's tricky. Life like a bubble does come to an end. And we kind of have patterns of beauty and decay. I mean, like, we shouldn't necessarily look at patterns only as things that we like. We can get patterns of abuse or patterns of negative thinking. All kinds of things come in patterns. As you said, in New York, it's like there was what was that quote from the movie Soul, which I saw a while ago. Someone shouted at me on the subway, and I kind of thought it was exciting, something like that. So yeah, I don't know, Charlotte, there we go. We're on to what do you think about thinking visually? Okay, so here's a picture that will be familiar to you of your journal, and I think there may be a few more of these to come. But yeah, so as an artist, but also maybe to Noorah, as someone who would think about designing policies and or thinking about how policies are designed, and you mentioned that sketching can be helpful. Like, what is there something about thinking visually that helps? Because of course you are an artist, but you're also a human being. You don't have to think visually all the time. Sometimes you might think in very different ways. So Amanda, what do you think about visual thinking that is so, like, how did you choose this as a profession, but like, what does it mean to you to like think visually, really?
Yeah. So for me, I think you could take it on a couple of levels. There was one point in my, career or trajectory at which I said to myself, I am determined to learn how to think visually. And for me, at that moment, that meant that every single thing that was said or that I thought, I could then, as instantaneously as possible in my mind, have something to draw for it. And so that to me was sort of one way, right, of thinking visually. And I think there's also a lot of people think in pictures, right? Or you think in, like somebody asks you for a memory, and maybe some folks in their memories have this like association, and you can see a jar of pickles, and all of a sudden you're brought back somewhere completely differently, right? And so that sort of is a visual thinking leap to really think about, that time you had pickles with your mom, or I don't know. But I do think that thinking visually allows and particularly if you're someone who doesn't think visually, that then allows people to just build this new perspective, right? So, and for me, it's all about perspective, right? Because the second we add another perspective, we've gained awareness of some kind. And the more awareness we gain, the more we can show up in the world in a grounded place as ourselves fully.
I think that feels also, I feel like that I identify with the conversation that I was having yesterday with Noorah about designing policies and how would we choose to bring, who would we bring to the table, right? So if it's coming only from powerful people designing the policies versus everybody who's affected designing the policies, like you could get a very visual, tangible sense of like, how do you lay out the tables? How do you lay out the meeting rooms? How do you lay out the calendar of events? Even if you're not thinking of it as a visual artist, you may be thinking about it in terms of space or relationships. So Noorah, how does thinking visually impact you, or do you think when you think about it, you think in very different ways when you think about the kinds of stuff you do? As you mentioned, making diagrams, but maybe, you know, again, I'm assuming that you're not a visual artist. Maybe you are in your hobby life, a visual artist. How do you think about things? How do you feel like you come to terms with these, you know, the need to add, for example, different perspectives?
Right. I mean, for me, I draw a lot of diagrams, especially when I'm trying to think through a certain argument or a certain theory or things like that. Like connecting concepts to each other is really important for me, because like I have a hard time just writing things down. So it helps me to like first visualize how ideas are interconnected and then what goes on in between. But like lately I've been thinking, I'm like, am I like operating a lot within a certain boundary? And if so, what is the next boundary, or how do we shift it? I'm having thoughts about like between shifting boundaries and expanding boundaries. So like, how does that look? And then, yeah, so maybe it's, if I shift a certain boundary, I could think of different concepts and how that could be imagined and like visualized. So. Oh,
that reminds me that we discussed about visualizing patterns, and we talked about wholeness. So we talked about, you know, the initial image we had was an egg, a sense of wholeness of an egg. And you said, but what if this egg is actually more like a soap bubble and kind of morphs into a different shape? So it's like, it's still the same boundary, but it's now it's shifting and it's much more dynamic. And I think that, like, you know, anyway, that sort of, that works. I think the other thing you can do with boundaries, I guess, is cross them or transgress them. So you talked about shifting them, breaking them down, but you can also cross them with you know, at your peril, I guess, sometimes. But you know,
yeah, I think that's like also especially important if we're trying to think of like the future and how we can start visualizing the future. You know, I think that's something worth thinking about, and especially things that we cannot imagine yet either. How do we design that? How do we think about it? You know, and I think visuals really help.
Yeah, I mean, what a cool word you just used. I mean, clearly you've been very primed on this, but you just said visualize the future, and I think everyone would use that term to talk about the future. Almost everyone would, and so it's like we're geared towards visualizing the future, not, I don't know, imagining what the future will sound like or something.
Yeah.
Like that. Yes, please, Amanda.
I also really appreciate the way we sort of, everything in our world is visual, essentially, right? For most of us who can see. And I did just see that comment too that popped up about ways of thinking, different ways of seeing. That's a Berger book. That was one of the first books I read in college as an artist too, which I really appreciate. And so I think about sort of how the visuals are everywhere in our lives for the most part today, right? They are, you know, on our TV screens, they're on our phones, they're on all of our tech, they're in our world, right? They're the way that sort of marketing and or folks attempt to reach out to us in order to, they sort of use and sometimes abuse visuals, right? And they've really like linked the ways of our human psyche and how we work to how they present things to us, right? And that is a thing that somehow is not widely known, right? That's a thing that to me might even be helpful, right? When you're thinking about like policy making. I don't know if there's a parallel here that you can make, Noorah, but I'm really appreciating sort of how much I don't even know about that as an artist, right? And I understand sort of form and this, that, and the other, right? I understand like these are some marks made, right? That Charlotte just popped up here for us, right? And so this can be the most beautiful, most amazing thing ever if I'm having a conversation and talking about marks, right? Whereas, you know, it's not necessarily the most beautiful thing ever, right? And so I think there's not only that idea that I was just talking to, but there's also this overlay of what's beautiful, right? And what's ugly, and how do we not just think about things in binary as well. I just smooshed a bunch of ideas there together.
But maybe I can talk about this particular image where you know, the other one, some of them were kind of iconic, but this is like a landscape, right? So you had drawn a flower, which was iconic, and then you had some other thing which was just like kind of almost more like a texture, but here it's like all coming together in the form of an image. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you get these different levels of meaning, even though these are all pages from a sketchbook. The media are exactly the same in terms of the level of what that is as an image. It's very different. And as you said, we're immersed in these things on a day-to-day basis. Charlotte, if we could go on to question 3, we're coming up towards the end of a half hour, although it's so rich, I feel like we could be doing this for much more than a half hour. How can life patterns inform the Peeragogy Handbook version 4? So Amanda, we last time we made a handbook, it was, I think, 2016, so we were quite delayed in terms of the version 4, but we're dead set to make one. This image resonated to me with the one we just saw from your sketchbook. This is a painting of a bridge over a river, and the idea of this image as the iconic image was finding the road through a territory. So here the road is going over this, like I suppose the river in this case could be a boundary between the left and the right banks. So there's a way across that boundary. But I wonder if we could go ahead a couple more images. Yeah, that one. So this is a little network image, almost if you can imagine the New York subway system. I don't think in Austin they have anything quite like it. This is a kind of a map of where we're going, we could say, visually with the Peeragogy Handbook, with these different kind of areas. And so, you know, the little blue part up in the top is kind of, you could imagine that being a bit like Brooklyn, or more like the Bronx, I guess. This is backwards, but like, you see what I'm saying? Like, you have these kind of neighborhoods, and the idea is to be able to move around the components and kind of recombine them. And so this is using some of the software tools that Noorah was alluding to, using some free software that helps us interact with and visualize indeed patterns at this level of content. So like, you can see here, this part looks like a little bit like a star, and that part looks a little bit more like a tangle. So it's like bringing a kind of visual way of thinking towards a medium of writing. And that's similar to, but different from your, and here's the, one of the maintainers of the software that's kind of under the bonnet here. There's a nice conflation in representations between what is well expressed and what is beautiful, implying a level of visualness to the assessment of arguments. Wow, it feels very true. And I think that one of the criticisms of the handbook, I think, has often been not that it's not visual looking, but that it's just sometimes confusing. And is all this stuff in there very well expressed? Is it redundant? Is it helpful? So I think building in kind of this aesthetics of writing into the work itself as a whole work is one of the ways in which we could use visual thinking above and beyond petitioning you for more drawings. It's also thinking about how does the thing flow as a whole work. So that's me rambling for quite a while, I think, but I wonder if the two of you have any thoughts, either from the standpoint of a artist or policy analyst or just human being on some of these thoughts about how to create a document.
Right.
I think, yeah, Noorah, please.
Of the network, the image that you showed of like the network of ideas, but let's remember that this is a network, so nothing is structural about it. Although we can say that there is something structural about it, because you're making the decision of what goes where and how things are interconnected. So the idea is like, is this the full image, or is that just a snapshot in time and then it could transform into something else? So like, this is when I think about life patterns, that patterns are also transformative over time. And so I think that's something worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I think all the missing information in this picture is like, who are the people creating this? What are the problems and challenges that they're confronting? Because I think you were both maybe talking about at the start of this conversation, like, different problems that we could confront, whether it's too much snow or having a difficult conversation with somebody. We don't see that when we pull all of that out. So yeah, I think that's a good reminder about the limitations of this network. But maybe if we had a visual image, you'd get some more of that texture and those kind of integratedness things. In fact, that reminds me to take a screenshot right now for posterity's sake. So, Amanda, would you be, speaking of screenshot, I see you've been sketching there a bit. Are you willing to kind of do a little show and tell of what you've been doing on paper?
Sure. Just tiny pieces here. So just from the beginning of our conversation, talking about, I'm going to say, like, boundaries, where we are, the inside and outside, which I'm on the wrong side pointing, which I took to like being human, feeling, seeing, a little bit of nature with the tree, differences between our insides and outsides. Also the sort of shifting patterns here, right? And how we think, right? There's so much there. Like, we could talk about that for hours, right? About just how we shift our own patterns, right? How we move things, who we bring to the table when we build policy. Yeah. And then just patterns over time, just transforming, right? So yeah. Forgive the shakiness of my hand, but how it just moves, right?
Yeah.
Right. And it's not always a linear thing too. I think that's something that is super evident when you start talking patterns, right? Because it's not linear. It's not even like in time as linear, right? Like there's layers upon layers. So
I think this is what makes, from my mind, and Charlotte, it'd be great to have you in as the someone who's both publisher and who's been along and on this journey since the beginning. But this is one of the things that makes Peeragogy quite exciting, is like, unlike just reading a book, like here's a random one about Marcel Noir. It's a book of detective stories, but like this, what we have goes so far beyond the page, right? It's about our relationships with each other more so than just producing a book. And I think, like, Charlotte, as a publisher, like, you have lots of relationships with other publishers and other people, but I think you've expressed about how Peeragogy has become, part of the way you do things. And I get that vibe maybe for all of us in our own spheres, that like it's become a kind of thing that goes beyond just a page or an artifact or a specific edition of a book. So I don't know if you'd love to add some more comments, closing things out at the end of a half hour. I guess the one thing we can say is that we do often, after these things, carry on in a separate discussion afterwards. So yeah, you could introduce that, and maybe you can introduce that, Charlotte. That'd be fantastic.
Right, and we do have some more episodes coming up on what we're calling our accelerators. So we're going to be taking the Peeragogy concepts and kind of going into an enterprise or even a business and brainstorming. So publishing will be part of that. But it's true. I just I feel kind of like there's something missing if I'm just doing something myself, and it's been really enriching to have, like I think Amanda's a point about the memory. You don't think of a word, you think of a picture. Like you think of your mother putting on your shoes or something. It's not a word. It's so yeah. But we are, after each episode, we try to do a Peeragogy or project action review, and we'll be showing the link to that, so you can join at meet.jit.c/Peeragogy. It's MEET.JIT.SI/Peeragogy. It's an open source video conferencing platform. And if you'd like to discuss what we learned today and get to know the people you saw, it would be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we're just about keeping this to half an hour. It says 29 minutes and 44 seconds. So I'll just take the opportunity to say this has been an exciting and really engaging podcast that I'm sure could have gone on for more than half an hour. So this has been only a taste of what's possible. But yeah, thanks so much for being here and for tuning in for those who watched.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for the idea, Amanda. All right, we'll close it out. And thanks for everybody who listened. And please look for the podcast on your audio apps in the next day or so.
Oops, the birds have come in now. Okay, see you at the meet.jitsi if you